The shattered image. Willow Creek was the kind of town where life felt timeless, like it was etched into the fabric of the hills and meadows that surrounded it. People knew each other by name, exchanged pleasantries at the post office, and grew up in houses that seemed as permanent as the landscape itself. It was a place where secrets were rare, and the few that lingered in whispered corners felt as if they were there only for a moment before being forgotten. The sun always seemed to set slower in Willow Creek, casting a golden glow over the sleepy town as the day slowly melted into night. It was the kind of place where you could relax, take a deep breath, and let go of the worries of the world. But that was before everything changed. Ellie Harper sat on her porch one humid summer afternoon, sipping a glass of iced tea as she gazed out across the backyard. Her 8-year-old daughter, Lydia, playing beneath the tall oak tree. Her heart swelled with contentment. This was what happiness looked like, what stability felt like: a warm house, a loving husband, and a daughter whose laughter filled every corner of the world. "Mom, look at me," Lydia called out, spinning in circles, her dress twirling around her. Her golden curls flew around her face as she giggled, her joy pure and untainted. Ellie smiled, her heart light. Life, she thought, was perfect. The kind of life everyone dreams of, peaceful, quiet, and untouched by the storms of the world. But then, the quiet shattered. The back door slammed open with a force that sent a chill crawling down Ellie's spine. Lydia stumbled inside, her small body shaking with panic. Her face, usually a picture of innocence, was streaked with tears, her lips trembling as she rushed into her mother's arms. Ellie's heart clenched as she pulled her daughter close, her hands trembling with a growing sense of dread. "Mommy, Grandpa did bad things to me." Lydia's voice cracked as she spoke, the words tumbling out in a broken sob. For a moment, Ellie froze, the world around her spinning into a blur. She couldn't comprehend what she had just heard. What was Lydia saying? Her father, her beloved father, Henry, would never do such a thing. Not to her sweet Lydia, not to anyone. The thoughts swirled in Ellie's mind, but they couldn't settle. Not yet. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely a breath. As she knelt to meet Lydia's tear-filled eyes, her mind raced, struggling to make sense of the chaos swirling inside her. "Tell me what happened." Lydia's trembling hands gripped Ellie's arms tighter. "He said it was our little secret," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the very words held a weight too heavy for a child to carry. Ellie's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. The warmth that had once filled her chest was replaced by a coldness that chilled her to the bone. Her thoughts tumbled like broken glass, each piece sharp and painful. Before Ellie could react, her husband Mark entered the room. He had been outside working in the garden, and his face fell the moment he saw their daughter's tear-streaked face, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion and worry. Ellie struggled to explain, the words coming out in fragmented bursts, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of what Lydia had said. The accusation was too much to bear, too impossible to accept. How could it be true? How could Henry, her father, be capable of something like this? Mark's face darkened as he processed the words. "Henry," he whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's impossible." But Lydia's distress was undeniable. Ellie could see it in her daughter's tearful eyes, hear it in her shattered voice. "We need to talk to him," Mark said, his tone hardening with resolve. There was no turning back now. Ellie wanted to protest, to deny what was happening, but the terror in Lydia's eyes, the way her small body trembled in her arms, made it impossible. Her father's house, the one she had once thought of as a sanctuary, now seemed like the last place she wanted to go. They drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the tires on the winding road leading to Henry's house. It was only a few miles away, but the distance between them now felt like a chasm. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to hold herself together. She kept glancing at Lydia in the backseat, who sat clutching a stuffed bunny, her hands white-knuckled around the fabric. "Where did you get that?" Ellie asked, trying to focus on something, anything, other than the storm brewing inside her. Lydia didn't look up. She simply muttered, "From Grandpa's room." Ellie's eyes locked onto the small broken necklace that Lydia held tightly in her hand. It wasn't hers. It wasn't something Ellie had ever seen before. The charm on the necklace was an odd symbol, a jagged triangle intersected by a straight line. There was something about it that made Ellie's stomach churn, but she couldn't place why. When they arrived at Henry's house, Ellie tried to steady herself. Her father greeted them at the door with his usual warmth, but there was something different about his smile now. It felt rehearsed, false. His eyes flicked uneasily to Lydia, and Ellie saw the slightest hesitation in his step. "Ellie, Mark," he said, his tone too cheerful for the gravity of the situation. "What brings you here?" Mark didn't waste a moment. "Lydia says you." He stopped himself, his voice tightening with anger and confusion. "She says you did something to her." Henry's face paled as his eyes widened in disbelief. "That's ridiculous," he stammered. "I would never." But Lydia's voice cut through the air, a scream of fury and fear. "You're lying," she cried, her small body shaking with the intensity of her emotions. For the briefest moment, Ellie saw a flicker of something in her father's eyes, an unease that lasted only a second, but long enough to unsettle her. His posture stiffened, his face turning cold. "Get out of my house," he snapped, his voice sharper than Ellie had ever heard it. Mark stepped forward, but Ellie placed a hand on his arm. "Let it go," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on her. As they drove back home in silence, Ellie's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: doubt, fear, confusion. Could Lydia have been mistaken, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? That night, as Ellie sat at the edge of Lydia's bed, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, she tried to convince herself that everything would be okay. But the truth, whatever it was, seemed to be creeping closer, a shadow that followed her every step. She turned the broken necklace over in her hands, tracing the unfamiliar symbol with her fingers. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the necklace was a clue, an emblem of a past she couldn't yet understand, a past that would soon unravel everything she thought she knew. And so, with no other choice, Ellie made a vow to herself. She would uncover the truth. No matter what it cost her, no matter how much it hurt, she would find out what had happened to Lydia. The world around her might be falling apart, but for Lydia's sake, she would hold it together. And in the darkness of uncertainty, she would search for the light, the weight of truth. The following days in Willow Creek felt like a slow descent into a world Ellie no longer recognized. What had once been a community that felt familiar, warm, and unwavering was now shrouded in uncertainty. Ellie's every movement felt like it was under a magnifying glass. People whispered behind closed doors, their eyes flicking nervously when she passed by. The small town she had always known as a place of comfort now felt like a prison of suspicion. The ache in Ellie's chest never subsided. The words her daughter had uttered that fateful afternoon echoed in her mind like a constant drumbeat, a reminder that her world had fractured into pieces too shattered to mend. "Grandpa did bad things to me." Lydia's innocent voice still haunted her. Could this really be true? Her father, her beloved father, the man she had always seen as a protector, a pillar of stability. Could he really have done something so unthinkable? Ellie hadn't slept in days. The hollow feeling inside her had taken root, and she couldn't shake the gnawing unease that clung to her every thought. She had tried to tell herself that it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe Lydia had misinterpreted something. Maybe her mind had played tricks on her. But the pain in her daughter's eyes, the terror in her small voice, it was real. And no amount of reasoning or denial could undo the damage those words had inflicted on Ellie's soul. Ellie found herself pacing the kitchen late one evening, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. Mark had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the endless stream of phone calls and meetings with the authorities. He had always been the calm one in their relationship, the steady anchor to her wild, emotional storms. But now even he seemed distant, his mind preoccupied with the investigation, his once comforting presence now weighed down by the growing tension between them. Her gaze flickered to Lydia, who was curled up on the couch, her head resting against a pillow, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. The sight of her innocent daughter, still so young, so fragile, sent a sharp pang of guilt through Ellie's chest. Had she failed Lydia somehow? Had she missed the signs of something deeper, something darker? The doorbell rang, breaking the silence in the house. Ellie's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively glanced at Lydia, who had lifted her head slightly at the sound. The woman at the door was a stranger, a professional figure whose presence immediately put Ellie on edge. Detective Sarah Connor stood on the other side, her expression unreadable. She was a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that left no room for softness or pity. Ellie felt the weight of the moment settle around her like a heavy fog. This wasn't just some random visit. It was another step toward the truth, or the unraveling of it. "Mrs. Harper," Detective Connor said with a measured tone, her voice low and respectful, but also firm. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Ellie nodded, stepping aside to let the detective into the house. The tension in the air was palpable. Lydia shifted uneasily on the couch as the detective approached her, kneeling down to her level with a practiced, gentle smile. "Lydia, honey," she said softly, "I know this is a very hard thing to talk about, but I need to ask you some questions. I'm here to help, okay?" Lydia hesitated for a moment, her small fingers twisting the fabric of her bunny's ear. Ellie's heart twisted, but she remained silent, standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on her daughter. This was Lydia's moment to speak, to share what she had kept locked inside her for so long. With a small nod, Lydia finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He touched me," she said, her words punctuated by the quiet sob that followed. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, her knees almost buckling under the weight of what she had just heard. She gripped the doorframe tightly, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The confirmation, the terrifying, horrible confirmation of her worst fears, was like a slap in the face, a painful reminder that everything she had believed about her family was now called into question. Detective Connor gave Lydia a comforting smile, her voice calm and steady. "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart," she said. "You're very brave." Ellie could barely breathe. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around her as her mind raced to process what Lydia had just revealed. Mark had been right. There was no denying it now. Her father was the one who had harmed her daughter. The thought was too much to bear, too monstrous to comprehend. The detective turned to Ellie, her expression somber. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harper," she said softly. "I know this is incredibly difficult, but we have to follow through with the investigation, for Lydia's sake." Ellie nodded numbly, barely able to hold it together. The detective left soon after, leaving Ellie and Lydia alone in the oppressive silence of the house. For a long while, Ellie just stood there, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the shattered pieces of her world. How could her father, her protector, the one who had raised her, be capable of such evil? Was it really possible that someone she had trusted with her own life had been capable of hurting her daughter in the worst way? The days that followed were a blur of emotions, grief, disbelief, anger, and a deep, gnawing sadness. The town's whispers grew louder, the murmurs spreading like wildfire through the tight-knit community. People who had once smiled warmly at Ellie now looked away, their faces clouded with pity or judgment. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, their silent accusations that stung worse than any words ever could. Ellie tried to go about her daily routine, but it felt like an impossible task. She had always been the heart of her family, the one who held everything together. But now she was falling apart at the seams. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming need to protect Lydia and uncover the truth. But with every step she took toward the truth, she felt as though she was being pulled further into the darkness. One night, as Ellie sat in the dim light of the kitchen, the necklace Lydia had found clutched tightly in her hand, her mind went back to the symbol etched into it, the jagged triangle intersected by a straight line. She had tried searching for answers online, but every attempt had led to dead ends. The symbol didn't appear to have any significant meaning, at least not one that was immediately clear, but something about it seemed so familiar, so unsettling. As she turned the necklace over and over in her hands, a thought struck her like a lightning bolt. Could it be connected to her family's past? Was there something buried in the history of her father's life that could explain the darkness Lydia had unwittingly uncovered? It was a wild thought, but it was the only lead she had left. Desperation had a way of sharpening the mind, and Ellie was determined to follow this thread wherever it led. The next morning, she found herself standing in the driveway of her childhood home. The house looked different now, its once comforting facade now tinged with suspicion. Ellie stood there for a long moment, her eyes tracing the familiar features of the place where she had grown up, the place where she had once felt safe. "I need answers," Ellie whispered to herself, steeling herself for whatever she might uncover. As she walked up to the door, her mind flashed back to the conversation she had had with her father over the years. She had always thought of him as the steady, reliable figure in her life. But now, every memory felt tainted with doubt. What if the man she had trusted most in the world wasn't who she thought he was? Her hand trembled as she knocked on the door. Henry answered it quickly, his expression neutral, but his eyes darted nervously when he saw her standing there. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a little too harsh. Ellie swallowed hard, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "About the past. About Grace." For a moment, her father's face tightened, his eyes hardening at the mention of the name. "Don't go digging into things you don't understand," he said coldly. But Ellie wasn't backing down. She had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The necklace, the symbol, the silence. Everything pointed to something darker, something buried deep within the family. As she stepped into the house, Ellie realized she wasn't just searching for answers anymore. She was searching for redemption, for a way to save her daughter, and perhaps even her father, from the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Into the abyss. Ellie hadn't been back to her childhood home in years. The house, a small two-story brick building tucked in the heart of Willow Creek, stood eerily still as if frozen in time. The once inviting warmth of the front porch, where she'd spent countless afternoons with her father, now felt like a facade, masking something darker beneath the surface. The tall oaks lining the driveway, which had once been a symbol of security and family, now loomed overhead like silent sentinels, casting long shadows over the place she had once called home. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers gripping the edge of the porch railing as she tried to steady herself. Her pulse hammered in her chest. Ellie had always thought of her father's house as a sanctuary, a place of refuge, a haven from the world. But now, as she faced the door, all she felt was the weight of betrayal pressing down on her, suffocating her with each breath. As she knocked on the door, Ellie's stomach twisted with dread. She had no idea what she would find inside, no idea how deep the lies ran. But one thing was certain, she couldn't stop now. Not after everything that had come to light. Not after Lydia's tearful confession, after the chilling symbol on the necklace, and after the words from her daughter that had torn apart the world she thought she knew. Her father answered the door swiftly, his face neutral but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease when he saw her standing there. Henry Harper, the man who had always seemed so dependable, so trustworthy, now seemed like a stranger to Ellie. The warm, paternal gaze that had once made her feel safe now felt like a mask, hiding something far darker beneath it. "What are you doing here?" Henry asked, his voice strained but controlled, a note of coldness creeping into his words. "I thought we had already talked." Ellie stood tall, forcing her shoulders back despite the fear that gripped her. "We need to talk about the past, Dad," she said, her voice unwavering, though her heart threatened to break with every word she spoke. "About Grace, and what you've been hiding." The mention of Grace was like a slap to his face. Ellie saw the color drain from her father's features as his eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening in a way that sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was a look she hadn't seen in years, not since the days when she was a child, and she'd done something wrong in his eyes. Those moments when his anger had been directed at her mother, when the tension between them had been so palpable that Ellie had been forced to retreat into silence. "Grace is a name you don't want to bring up, Ellie," Henry said, his voice low and menacing. "You're digging into things you don't understand. It's better if you leave it alone." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. "I can't leave it alone, Dad. Not after everything that's happened. Lydia, she's scared. And I need to know the truth. What happened to Grace? And what did you do?" Her father's face tightened further, his eyes flicking to the side as if searching for an escape, as if the walls of the house were closing in on him. For a brief moment, Ellie saw something in his expression that she had never seen before, a flicker of fear, of guilt, maybe even shame. But it vanished just as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual cold mask. "I told you to stop," Henry snapped, his voice suddenly harsh, a flash of anger sparking in his eyes. "This doesn't concern you." It never did. Ellie swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold her ground. She couldn't back down now, not when she was so close to the truth. "You don't get to control this anymore. Not with Lydia's life on the line. I won't stop until I understand what happened, and I won't stop until you're held accountable for it." Her father's demeanor shifted again, this time in a way that was both unsettling and revealing. The smile that had once been so warm now looked forced, thin, like something that had been carefully crafted over the years to cover up the cracks that were beginning to show. He stepped back from the door, his eyes flicking to the hallway behind him. "You shouldn't have come here, Ellie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked into the house, his footsteps heavy against the wooden floor. Ellie hesitated for only a moment before following him, her resolve strengthening with each step she took. Whatever her father had been hiding, it was time for the truth to come out. The familiar scent of old wood and stale air greeted Ellie as she entered the living room. The furniture was the same as it had always been: overstuffed armchairs, a dark oak coffee table, and an old rug that had been worn thin by years of use. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the world outside. There was a heaviness in the air, a suffocating stillness that made Ellie feel as though she had stepped into another time, another world entirely. Her father motioned for her to sit, but Ellie ignored him, instead walking past the couch and toward the hallway. She had to know what he was hiding, what secrets he had buried over the years. There was no turning back now. "You think you're going to find answers here?" Henry's voice followed her, a note of warning in his tone. "You're just going to make things worse." Ellie didn't answer him. She couldn't. She was too focused on the task at hand, the need to understand, to piece together the fragments of her shattered reality. Her eyes fell on the staircase that led to the second floor. She had always avoided it as a child. It had always been off-limits, a place of mystery, a place where her father's private world had remained untouched by her innocent curiosity. But now she couldn't avoid it any longer. The answers, she felt, were up there. As Ellie reached the top of the stairs, she could hear her father's voice calling after her, but it was distant, muffled by the weight of her determination. The house felt colder now, as though something unseen was watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. She walked down the narrow hallway to the door of the attic. The old wooden floor creaked under her weight, the sound of her footsteps louder than they should have been. She reached for the brass handle, and twisted it slowly, the door creaking open with a reluctant groan. The attic was just as she remembered it, dusty, dim, and filled with forgotten relics of a lifelong past. Old boxes stacked high in the corners, faded photographs on the walls, and trunks filled with items her family had once cherished, but now seemed insignificant. But one trunk in the corner caught Ellie's attention. It was old, its leather worn and cracked with age. A faint smell of mildew lingered in the air around it. Ellie's hands trembled as she moved closer. She knew, without a doubt, that this was what she had been searching for. The thing her father had been so desperate to keep hidden. She knelt in front of the trunk, her fingers fumbling with the rusty latch. It gave way with a snap, and Ellie lifted the lid slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Inside, the trunk was filled with old photographs, letters, and other personal mementos. But what caught Ellie's eye was a small leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age. The name Grace was scrawled across the front in delicate handwriting, a name that had haunted Ellie's family for as long as she could remember. She opened the diary carefully, her fingers shaking as she turned the first few pages. The writing was small, cramped, and raw, filled with pain and confusion. Each word seemed to bleed with sorrow, a testament to a life lived in silence and fear. The first entry made Ellie's stomach churn. It spoke of a young girl named Grace who had been trapped in a suffocating world of fear and control. "Daddy says I'm too young to understand," one entry read, "but I know what he's doing is wrong. I've tried to tell Mom, but she just cries. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do anymore." Ellie's heart broke as she read on. It became clear that Grace's suffering had mirrored Lydia's, and that her father had been the one responsible. The truth Ellie had been unwilling to face now lay before her in the pages of Grace's diary, a truth that was too painful to accept. As she read, Ellie felt a cold presence behind her, and she turned to see her father standing in the doorway, his face ashen. His eyes, once full of pride and control, now seemed hollow, defeated. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said softly, his voice breaking. Ellie stood, clutching the diary in her hands, her mind reeling. "It's over, Dad. It's all out now. You can't hide anymore." Her father's face crumpled, and for the first time, Ellie saw him as he truly was, not the strong, indomitable figure she had grown up with, but a broken man, consumed by guilt and fear. The cracks in the foundation. The weight of the diary in Ellie's hands felt like a stone that had settled deep in her chest, sinking into her bones with a heaviness she couldn't shake. The room around her seemed to warp, the air thick with a tension that made it hard to breathe. Her father, Henry, stood in the doorway of the attic, his face pale and haggard, his eyes distant as though he were looking past her into a place that no longer existed. The silence stretched between them, taut and suffocating, each second a reminder of how far she had fallen from the man she once knew. Ellie clutched the diary tighter, her fingers trembling as they traced the edges of its worn pages. The name Grace echoed in her mind, like a call from the past that she could no longer ignore. She had always known there were cracks in her family, pieces of the past that didn't fit, stories that never made sense. But now, those cracks had split wide open, revealing a darkness that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. Henry's voice broke the silence, soft and broken. "You don't understand what you found, Ellie," he whispered, his tone carrying the weight of years of secrets. "I tried to protect you. From all of this. From Grace. From everything." Ellie felt a sickening knot form in her stomach. "Protect me," she repeated, her voice rising with a mix of disbelief and fury. "By keeping the truth from me. By hiding what you did to her. To Lydia." Her words felt like a slap, each one ringing with the anger she had tried so hard to suppress. The anger that now, finally, found its voice. Henry took a step back, his eyes darting nervously around the room as though searching for a way out. "You have to understand, Ellie. Grace, she was different. She was always different. And I didn't know how to protect her from herself." Ellie shook her head, unable to make sense of his words. Her father's excuses seemed flimsy, like an attempt to shield himself from the undeniable truth that now lay bare in front of them. The words in Grace's diary, her anguished cries for help, her desperate attempts to escape, had been buried for too long, hidden by years of denial. Different. Ellie scoffed, her voice cracking with emotion. She was a child, Dad. A child who needed help. And instead of helping her, you pushed her further into the darkness. Henry's eyes flickered with something. Guilt, shame, or perhaps even fear. But it quickly vanished, replaced by the hardened mask he had perfected over the years. You don't know what it was like. You don't know what I had to do to keep our family together. You wouldn't understand. Ellie's hands clenched into fists, the anger and betrayal surging within her like a tidal wave. She couldn't let him off the hook. Not this time. Not after everything Lydia had gone through. Not after all the lies he had spun to keep his family bound to his twisted version of reality. I don't need to understand, Dad, she said, her voice low but steady, the finality of her words ringing through the attic. I only need to know that you're responsible. For everything. Henry's face hardened at her accusation, and for the first time, Ellie saw a glimpse of the man who had been hiding behind the fatherly facade all these years. The man who had made his own choices, who had chosen to silence Grace's suffering, to drown it in a sea of excuses and manipulation. You think I'm the only one to blame? He asked, his voice bitter, his eyes cold with a resentment that Ellie hadn't expected. You think you're the only one who's been hurt by all of this. You don't know how many times I tried to make things right, to fix everything before it was too late. Ellie stepped forward, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the words spilled from her. You didn't try to fix anything, Dad. You covered it up. You let Grace suffer in silence. And now you're doing the same to Lydia. I won't let you do that anymore. Henry's expression twisted into something darker. You think you're the hero here? He sneered, his voice rising with a sudden surge of anger. You think you can just come in and save everyone. You don't know anything about what I've had to live with. You don't know the things I had to sacrifice to keep this family from falling apart. Ellie stood still, her heart pounding, her mind whirling with 1,000 emotions she couldn't name. She had always been afraid of this moment. The moment when the truth would come out, when the foundation of her family would crumble beneath the weight of its own lies. But now that it had happened, there was no turning back. I don't want to save you, Dad, she said, her voice firm, unwavering. I want justice. For Grace, for Lydia, for everyone you've hurt along the way. There was a long pause, a heavy silence that hung between them like a suffocating fog. Henry's face had drained of color, his eyes downcast as if he couldn't meet Ellie's gaze. For a moment, he seemed smaller, broken, even, as though the weight of his past sins had finally caught up with him. You don't know the whole story, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There's more to it, more than you can possibly understand. Ellie's heart twisted. She could see the cracks in his facade, the fear and desperation that he was trying so hard to hide. But it didn't matter. It couldn't matter anymore. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how much it tore their family apart. If there's more to it, then tell me, Ellie said, her voice steady despite the emotions whirling inside her. Tell me what you've done. Tell me everything. I need to know the truth. Henry swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled envelope, handing it to Ellie with trembling fingers. This is the last thing I have of her, he said, his voice strained with emotion. I kept it all these years, hoping that someday, somehow, it would make sense. But I don't think it ever will. Ellie took the envelope, her hands numb as she carefully opened it. Inside, she found a series of old photographs, black and white images of Grace as a child, her wide, innocent eyes staring back at the camera. But it wasn't the photos that caught Ellie's attention. It was the letter, folded neatly beneath them. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers trembling as she read the carefully written words. I don't know how much longer I can stay. He's not what you think he is, Ellie. He's hiding something darker, something more dangerous. I've tried to leave, but he always finds a way to pull me back. Don't let him do this to you. You're stronger than I was. You can stop him. Please, for all our sakes, don't let him destroy you too." Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. The letter was from Grace. Her aunt had known. She had known what her father had done, what he had been hiding all these years. And now, it was up to Ellie to finish what Grace had started, to expose the darkness that had poisoned her family for decades. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ellie whispered, her voice breaking as the truth finally began to unravel. "Why didn't you stop?" Henry looked away, his eyes filled with regret and guilt. "I thought I was protecting you," he said softly. "I thought I was doing what was best for the family. But I was wrong." Ellie closed her eyes, her mind racing with the weight of everything she had just discovered. The truth was more horrifying than she had ever imagined, but now that it was out in the open, there was no turning back. She had to confront it, no matter the cost. "I'll make sure Lydia's safe," Ellie said, her voice filled with determination. "I'll make sure Grace's story is heard, and I won't let you get away with it." Henry's silence spoke volumes. He had no response, no defense, no way to stop her from unraveling the web of lies he had spun for so many years. And Ellie knew, in that moment, that the fight wasn't just about saving her daughter. It was about reclaiming the truth, no matter how painful it might be. It was about breaking the cycle of silence and fear that had plagued her family for so long. It was time to expose the darkness, no matter how deep it ran. A broken chain. The night was still, the heavy silence in Ellie's home echoing louder than any word spoken. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled tightly around the letter Grace had written. Grace's final plea for help. The ink on the paper felt like a lifeline, the only piece of the past that might unlock the secrets that had been buried for far too long. Ellie read the words over and over, trying to decipher the hidden truths within them, searching for any clue that might guide her forward in this tangled mess of betrayal and fear. Her father's cryptic words still echoed in her mind. "There's more to it. More than you can possibly understand." But what more could there be? What could justify the years of suffering Grace had endured? And now Lydia. The thought of her daughter, still so fragile and young, bearing the weight of a secret too heavy for anyone her age to carry, it crushed Ellie's spirit. The kitchen light above her flickered, casting strange shadows across the table. Ellie's eyes darted to the window, where the soft, golden light of the moon poured in. It was a still, serene night, but Ellie felt far from calm. The heaviness in her chest was suffocating, and the truth was like a boulder pressing on her heart. She had to keep moving forward, but each step felt like it was leading her deeper into an abyss. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. The name on the screen was one she hadn't expected. Detective Sarah Connor. Ellie hesitated for a moment, a knot tightening in her stomach. She had hoped for a break in the investigation, some glimmer of hope that could shed light on the darkness that had plagued her family. But as the phone rang again, Ellie knew there was no escaping the reality she had been forced to face. She answered the call. "Ellie." Detective Connor's voice was firm, but there was a note of urgency that made Ellie sit up straighter. "We found something. Something that connects your father to Grace's disappearance, and to Lydia's case. We need to meet." Ellie's pulse quickened. "What is it?" she asked, her voice shaky, despite her best efforts to sound steady. "We need you to come down to the station," the detective replied. "It's too important to discuss over the phone." Ellie swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The police station was a small, nondescript building, tucked away on a corner of Willow Creek's main street. It was a place that Ellie had only ever visited for routine matters, never once imagining that she would find herself sitting in an interrogation room, waiting for the answers to the questions she had been too afraid to ask. Detective Connor greeted her as she entered the small office, her expression grave. Ellie could feel the weight of the room pressing on her, the sense of something pivotal about to unfold. The detective gestured for Ellie to sit, and Ellie obliged, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You're going to want to hear this," Detective Connor began, sliding a file across the table. The thick stack of papers sat in front of Ellie, its contents a mystery she could no longer avoid. "We found evidence in your father's home. Something that connects him to the disappearance of Grace, and to what happened to Lydia." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? What kind of evidence?" The detective didn't speak immediately. Instead, she flipped open the file, revealing a series of photographs. Ellie's gaze snapped to the first image, a faded, worn photo of a young woman standing beside a man she could only assume was her father. The woman in the photo looked eerily familiar. She looked like Grace. No, she was Grace, but there was something in her expression that Ellie had never seen before. The haunting sadness in her eyes mirrored Lydia's fear from earlier. The pictures were taken in the late 1970s, Detective Connor said, her voice measured but filled with urgency. "They're from a time when Grace disappeared. Your father's involvement with her, his actions, were hidden under layers of deception. But we found something more, something that ties him directly to Grace's last known moments." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as the detective turned the page, revealing more images. This time, there were pictures of a cabin, isolated in a dense forest, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in around it. A note in the file explained that it was a location her father had frequented during the time Grace had been living with them. "This cabin was owned by your father," Detective Connor explained, her tone unwavering. "It was a place where Grace spent a lot of time, but it's also where we believe her life was taken from her." Ellie stared at the photos, her mind spinning as the reality of what was unfolding settled over her like a suffocating fog. There had always been whispers about Grace's disappearance, but Ellie had never suspected that the secrets of her family would extend so far, so deeply, into the realm of violence. "This doesn't make sense," Ellie whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would he do this? Why would my father? Why would he hurt Grace?" Detective Connor leaned forward, her gaze intense. "We believe Grace was trying to escape. She knew something about your father's dealings that he couldn't allow to get out. We've uncovered evidence that he threatened her, tried to control her, just as he did to Lydia." Ellie's mind reeled as the detective's words sunk in. Her father wasn't just hiding a past full of secrets. He was a man capable of unimaginable cruelty. "And Lydia?" Ellie asked, her voice shaking as she leaned forward in her seat. "What about Lydia?" "The connections are undeniable," Detective Connor replied. "The pattern of abuse is the same, and we have reason to believe your father tried to use Lydia in a similar way. We've got a team working on it, but we need your help. The more we have, the stronger our case will be." Ellie nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't sit back anymore. This wasn't just about protecting her family. This was about stopping a cycle that had gone on for far too long. As Ellie drove back home later that night, her mind was a blur. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, and her heart raced in her chest. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was far more horrific than she had ever imagined. Her father had been involved in far more than just the abuse of his own daughter. He had destroyed a life, silenced a woman who had dared to stand up to him. And now, he was trying to bury Lydia's truth. How many other lives had he ruined in his quest to maintain control? Ellie shuddered, her hands cold despite the warm summer air coming through the open window. When she arrived home, Lydia was already asleep in her room, her small figure curled beneath a blanket, her face peaceful in the way children's faces always were, untouched by the harshness of the world. Ellie watched her daughter for a long time, her heart aching with the knowledge of the darkness that had surrounded her, and the truth that Lydia would have to carry with her forever. The weight of the truth was too much to bear, but Ellie knew that she had to keep moving forward. No matter how broken her family had become, no matter how deep the pain ran, there was still a chance for Lydia to be safe. There was still a chance to stop her father, to put an end to the abuse that had tainted their lives for so long. Ellie looked at her daughter one last time before stepping back into the hallway. Her hands were shaking, her body exhausted, but her resolve was stronger than it had ever been. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. The fight for Lydia's future, and for Grace's forgotten story, was far from over. And Ellie would do whatever it took to make sure the truth was known. A reckoning at dawn. The air was thick with tension as Ellie paced the floor of her living room. The house, once a sanctuary filled with the laughter of a happy family, now felt cold and hollow. It wasn't just the emptiness of the rooms that unsettled her. It was the suffocating weight of the truth, a truth that had turned her world upside down in a matter of days. The past had a way of catching up to the present. And now, as Ellie stood in the dim light of early morning, she knew that there was no more room for hesitation. She had never imagined that she would be forced to confront her father in this way. Her childhood had been a time of safety, of simple joys that now felt like distant memories. Henry Harper had always been a figure of authority, a man who commanded respect in their small town of Willow Creek. To Ellie, he had been a rock, a father she admired and trusted. But now that image was shattered beyond repair. The man she had once called her protector had been the source of so much pain, pain that had plagued not just her family, but an innocent young girl named Grace, and now Lydia. As she looked out the window at the rising sun, Ellie felt the weight of the past pressing on her chest, the truth of it all still too difficult to comprehend. She had seen the photos, read the diary, heard the horrifying confessions. But it wasn't just about what had happened in the past, it was about what was happening right now. Lydia was terrified, and her father was desperate to keep his lies hidden, to maintain the facade of the perfect family. Ellie wasn't sure how far Henry would go to protect himself, but she knew it was time to find out. The phone on the counter buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Detective Connor. "We've got a lead. Your father is planning to leave town. We need to act fast." Ellie's heart skipped a beat. They were finally closing in. Henry was slipping away, but not without a fight. She had suspected that he would try to escape, try to bury everything in the past and leave the small town behind, as if that would erase his sins. But it wasn't going to be that easy. Not anymore. Ellie picked up the phone and dialed Mark's number. It rang several times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Ellie, what's going on?" His voice was groggy, but there was an undertone of concern that immediately snapped Ellie to attention. "We need to go to the cabin," she said, her voice steady despite the panic bubbling in her chest. "It's time to end this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Mark spoke again, his tone shifting to one of grim understanding. "I'll meet you there. Be careful, Ellie." Ellie hung up the phone and grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair. The cabin was miles away from town, hidden deep within the forest. It had always been a place of secrecy, a place where her father had taken refuge from the world. But today, it would become the place where everything was laid bare. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. The drive to the cabin was a blur of thoughts and emotions, each mile bringing Ellie closer to a confrontation she had been avoiding for far too long. The landscape outside the car window was shifting from rolling hills to dense, dark woods, the trees growing taller and closer together as they neared the isolated cabin. Ellie had been here before, many times, in fact. It had always been a retreat, a place where her father could escape the demands of family life. But now, as the wheels of the car crunched along the gravel road, it felt like a prison, one that held all of the secrets she had spent so long trying to uncover. When they finally arrived, the cabin stood in front of them like a dark sentinel, its weathered exterior barely visible in the dim light of dawn. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she stepped out of the car, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. She glanced over at Mark, who had already begun to move toward the door. He didn't need to say anything. They both knew what needed to be done. Ellie's heart pounded as she walked toward the cabin, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early morning. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds in the trees. As she approached the door, her mind flashed back to all the times her father had brought her here as a child, to show her the wonders of nature, to teach her about life. But now, the cabin was a tomb of memories, each one stained with the weight of her father's actions. Mark reached for the door handle and paused, glancing at Ellie. His expression was grim, his jaw tight with the anger he had been holding back since they first learned the truth. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice low. Ellie nodded, her eyes hard with resolve. "We have to do this, Mark. For Lydia. For Grace. For everything." Together, they pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was exactly as she remembered. Simple, rustic, filled with old furniture and the scent of wood and dust. But something felt different now. The walls seemed to close in, and the very air in the room felt thick with the secrets it held. Ellie's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of her father. And then she saw it. The old trunk in the corner of the room, the same trunk her father had never let her near. It was the same one that had held Grace's diary, the one Ellie had discovered in the attic just days before. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Her father had been hiding something here. Something important. Something that would finally tie everything together. Mark stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the trunk. "We need to open it," he said, his voice tight with determination. Ellie nodded. They both knew that the answers they were seeking lay inside. As they moved toward the trunk, the tension between them was palpable, like the moment before a storm. It was as if the very air in the cabin had thickened with the weight of the past, holding them captive, unwilling to let them go. With trembling hands, Ellie unlocked the trunk. The hinges creaked as it opened, revealing the contents hidden within. Old clothes, papers, and photographs were scattered inside, but it was the last item on top that caught Ellie's attention. It was a small leather-bound notebook, similar to the one Grace had kept. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, as though it had been opened countless times. Ellie pulled it out, her hand shaking as she turned it over. The name Ellie was written across the front in her father's familiar handwriting. A wave of nausea washed over her as she opened the first page. The words were jumbled, rushed, as though her father had written them in haste, trying to get them out before they consumed him. It was a confession of everything he had done, everything he had tried to bury. The events of Grace's disappearance, the years of manipulation, the lies. It was all there in black and white, every horrifying detail. Ellie felt the world around her shift, her heart racing, as she read through her father's words. The truth was uglier than she had ever imagined, and yet, for the first time, she could see the full picture. Henry Harper had been living a life of lies, and now he couldn't hide anymore. "Ellie." Mark's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone filled with disbelief and shock. This is beyond anything we imagined." Ellie looked up at Mark, her face pale but resolute. "It's time to end this," she said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil raging within her. "He can't escape anymore. We're going to make sure he pays for what he's done." They both knew that the battle wasn't over. The truth had been revealed, but the road to justice would be long and difficult. They would have to face the full extent of the damage Henry had caused, and there was no telling how far he would go to protect himself. But for the first time in days, Ellie felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and no one could stop them from fighting for it. The final act. The weeks that followed the discovery at the cabin were a whirlwind of emotions, legal proceedings, and revelations. Ellie had never imagined that she would be standing in the courtroom, facing her father, her protector, her rock, and knowing the man she had loved and trusted was responsible for so much pain. The trial was a long and painful process. The evidence, including the confession notebook, the photographs, and the diary, was irrefutable. Henry's crimes were laid bare for everyone to see. But despite the overwhelming evidence, it was still hard to reconcile the man she had known with the monster who had been hiding beneath the surface. Ellie had spent her whole life looking up to him, believing in his strength, his wisdom, his ability to protect their family. Now that image was shattered, and there was nothing left but the raw truth. Lydia's testimony, though brief and painful, was the catalyst that helped seal the case. The little girl had been brave beyond her years, speaking with a courage that Ellie could never have expected from such a young soul. She had told her story with a trembling voice, but with an undeniable clarity. She had been hurt, and now it was time to make sure no one else would suffer like she had. Mark stood beside Ellie every step of the way. The strain between them, the tension of the unknown, had faded into something stronger, something unspoken, but firm. They were a team. And when it was all said and done, when the verdict was read, it was a bittersweet moment. Henry was convicted, sentenced to life without parole for his crimes. The man who had once been the foundation of Ellie's life was gone, his legacy forever tainted by the truth he had tried so desperately to bury. But it wasn't the end of Ellie's journey. It couldn't be. In the weeks following the trial, Ellie and Lydia worked together to rebuild their lives, piece by piece. The road to healing was long and uncertain, but Ellie knew that the truth, painful as it was, had set them free. It was a truth that had torn their family apart, but it also opened the door to a new beginning. There would be no more lies, no more secrets. There would only be the future they chose to build for themselves. Ellie had learned something in the process of uncovering her father's dark past. It wasn't just that secrets destroy families. It was that silence, the refusal to confront the truth, is often the deadliest poison. The lies Henry had told, the years of manipulation and control, had kept them trapped in a cycle of fear and despair. But by speaking out, by confronting the darkest corners of their history, Ellie had taken the first step toward breaking that cycle for good. And for Lydia, Ellie promised herself she would never let her daughter's innocence be taken away again. She would protect her, guide her, and ensure that Lydia grew up with the freedom to be herself, a freedom that Ellie had so nearly lost. As the days turned into months, Willow Creek began to heal too. The town, once consumed by whispers, slowly started to find its voice again. Ellie had been afraid that the community would forever judge her, that she would be forever branded by the darkness her father had left behind. But instead, she found support in unexpected places. Neighbors who had once avoided her began to offer help, to show kindness. And although the scars of the past would never fully fade, Ellie knew that Willow Creek was capable of change, just as she had been. One evening, as Ellie sat on the porch with Lydia, watching the sun dip behind the hills, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Lydia was drawing, her colorful crayons scattered on the table beside her. Ellie watched her, the soft glow of the sunset bathing her daughter's face in warmth, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel weighed down by the past. She had broken free. "You're safe now," Ellie whispered to herself, the words barely audible, but powerful. "We're both safe." In that quiet moment, Ellie realized that no matter how dark the past had been, no matter how broken her family had become, they had made it through. The darkness had been faced and understood. The lies had been exposed, and the truth had been spoken. And while the journey ahead would be hard, Ellie now had the strength to walk it, with Lydia by her side, toward a future built on honesty, love, and the unbreakable bond between mother and daughter. The lesson was clear. No matter how painful the truth, it is always better to confront it, to speak it, and to fight for what's right. Only then can the healing begin. And for Ellie and Lydia, healing was just the beginning. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.